While access to high-quality journalism and credible reporting have never been more prevalent, the media's role has never been more challenging as they face mounting pressure to increase output, produce compelling content that stands out in a 24-hour news cycle, and drive engagement. According to Science 2022 State of the Media report, journalists' biggest challenge is maintaining credibility as a trusted news source and combating accusations of fake news. As a close second, journalists cite the impact that smaller staff and fewer resources are having on their workloads. In fact, 3 in 10 journalists are filing 10 or more stories per week. And when it comes to the sources journalists find most useful for generating stories or story ideas, more than a third of journalists cited press releases, making it the top answer. More than 3/4 want to receive press releases from brands and PR pros over any other type of content. Trends and market data rank second, and nearly half want event invitations. So how do we go about creating media coverage that fuels predictable revenue growth? That's a question our guest today is best placed to answer. Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutworth.com. I'm Vinay Koshy and our guest today is Mickie Kennedy. Mickie, you're the founder and president of eReleases, the small business leader for press release distribution. I think you're now celebrating over 24 years in business, and you're an expert at helping small businesses increase their visibility and credibility. Your goal, of course, is to help small businesses, startups, authors, and the like get website traffic and better quality customers through coverage in the media. I'm curious though, Mickie, was there a specific incident or event that triggered this journey or this idea of creating e-releases? If so, was the problem that you were trying to solve at that time still the same as it is the one today?
I think it's evolved a little bit. Around 27 years ago, I was working for a telecom research startup as employee number 3, and I had a creative writing background. And they said, since you're writing, figure out press releases for us. And we had a lot of data, and I looked through the data and tried to figure out what were interesting stories that the data was telling us. And I put those together in press releases and I faxed them out to the media. And the more faxing that we did, the more calls we got from journalists saying, could I just email it to them? Because we worked with a lot of data and numbers, they found it was easier to work with a Word document or an email rather than a fax. And so I just realized how much easier it was to hit send on an email than it is to program a fax machine with a couple hundred numbers. And so that gave me the idea for email as a potential platform for sending press releases. And I spent about a year in the evenings and on the weekends just reaching out to journalists and asking if I could send them press releases via email. And a little over 25 years ago, they were okay with that. And so that's what I launched with. Over the years, the Newswire, PR Newswire reached out to us. They're the oldest and largest Newswire press releases in the US and also North America as well. And I pointed out that their distribution cost way more than mine does, and that my customers just couldn't afford it. And they did not run away. They tried to make the numbers work. And we do stuff like scheduling the press releases for next business day because they have an overnight editorial team that's not very busy. And by setting up our releases overnight, it didn't cost them additional labor for doing that. So we did try to find a partnership that would work between the two of us. And it's been a really good partnership for over 10 years.
Well, brilliant. And in those early days when you were delving into press releases yourself, were you getting queries from outside of that telecom startup to help out? Or
So I started thinking I was going to specialize just in technology. And I reached out to a lot of technology editors. And what I found is I would say 10 to 15% of them said, I'm not in technology anymore. I now do fashion or I do retail. It was really strange because I thought that if you were a technology editor, you'd stay a technology editor. And it seemed like they were moving around. So I said, hey, I'll put that down. And if I ever get any fashion releases or retail releases, I'll send them your way. And after a while, I just said, you know what, it makes sense to just try and branch out. And I started with 12 industries when I launched. And we now have, I think, around 100 or more industries that are just segmented out by different journalist beats. But it is funny how if you're a journalist one day in retail, the next day you could be writing about food or something different. And I guess the real importance is that they're really good writers and they can write about anything.
I'm also curious, given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
My personal area of strength is strategizing the types of press releases that get media pickup. I find most of my roles at e-releases today is a little bit of marketing and a lot of just strategy and education for my customers. And a lot of my customers are doing the typical types of press releases. They're doing the press release about the new company hire, the new VP of HR. They're doing a product launch press release where it's basically, here's our product and here's a bullet list of features. And what I'm trying to do is go back to them and say, hey, there are other types of press releases you could be doing. And even the press releases that you are doing, you could do better. For example, the product launch press release, launching it and having a list of features, it doesn't allow journalists to build a story. And at the end of the day, journalists are story builders first and foremost. And if you were to add to your features list a case study, a customer who used your product, what were the results that they saw? And ideally a quote from them, all of a sudden you can build a story with that. Here's a new product. Here's someone's experience with it. Here's what they have to say about it. And here's a list of some features and things like that. I really find that my value is looking at my customers to succeed because we're doing about 12 to 14,000 press releases a year. And some of them do really well where they get like a dozen earned media pickups. These are original articles that are written about them. But I would say 95% of my customers don't get any real earned media. And it's sad, but when you look at the type of press releases that they're doing, very safe, non-newsworthy type press releases. And what I'm saying is you can do newsworthy press releases, even if you feel you're not newsworthy at all. I have one that works for anybody. Yeah, and that type of press release is a survey or study within your industry. Anybody can do a survey or study. You don't have to be a recognized expert in your industry. And if you do this over time, you will be recognized as an expert in your industry. It's a matter of putting together a really interesting questionnaire with questions that are really timely right now. What's going on in your industry? Is there economic uncertainty? Is there a recession looming or not? Everybody's always asking questions like that. So you can ask, what's your marketing dollars look like over the next 2 or 3 quarters? Do you plan on spending less or more? Do you plan on laying off? Do you plan on hiring? Are you having staffing issues? People wanting to work from home that don't want to go back into the office? And so asking really timely questions that are the types of things that people would want to know what the answer is today really guarantees that the journalists will jump on it and write articles about it. And I get pushback from some clients saying, I wouldn't know who to send the survey to. And I guarantee you, I haven't seen an industry yet that doesn't have dozens of small and independent trade associations, some of which you may belong to, that you could just reach out to and ask if they'll send it to their members, other people in your industry. And that's a great way to get it out there. Do mention that you'll be issuing a press release over the wire and you would love to mention them in it because the small and independent trade associations don't get a lot of media attention. So they'll see that as a win-win. All they have to do is just send an email or share on social media or both of those things with their members. And that works for anybody. I've never had that fail, with one notable exception where one person asked the community one question, and it wasn't a very interesting question. And so they were not a good student of mine because I'm like minimum 12 and ideally 16 questions. I like 4 questions on each page so that if someone leaves halfway in the survey, you have 8 responses, put the most important questions up front. And just try to get as many of those as you can. It takes as little as 150 responses for journalists to be okay with it. I've had people with the surveys of under 200, under 300 responses do very well. It's just a matter, did they ask really compelling questions and what were the results? And what you're going to do in a press release is share what you feel were the 3 or 4 biggest aha moments from the survey. You're not going to want to put all 16 questions in the press release, but you do want to build a page on your website where you do put all the responses and build it out, because those resource pages will get linked to by journalists, and journalists will go there and see if they can flesh out a different story. But what you're going to do is then provide some analysis and have a quote in the press release about why you feel the data skewed a certain way. And again, it's positioning you as the expert, and it guarantees that when an article gets written, they're going to include you because you're the author of the survey and you're the person who's being quoted in there. So it's really a great way for anybody to become news and newsworthy. It does take a little bit of work, but I find it works quite well. And I got that idea because I had one client who does 30 surveys a year. They represent lots of verticals. They have a website with lots of verticals, and they decided to start doing surveys for each vertical. And they do 1 to 2 surveys a year for each vertical. And it just works every time, 8 to 14 articles for every press release that they do. And they're all linking to these individual vertical sites. And they're just ranking really high in the search engines, and they're getting lots of traffic, and they're getting lots of media attention, and it works really well for them. And I was like, could this work for other people? So I've done it for a local auto repair shop in Pennsylvania. I've done it with lots of clients who've been very successful doing a survey or study. And it really is a way in which you can become and manufacture the news and be extremely newsworthy. So that's the big difference for me in my business is I'm the one who looks at what's working and tweaks it and tries to determine, is this something that other people can replicate and use? And often it is.
And you touched upon something that I feel is important, which is strategy, because most people, I think, would approach this idea of doing press releases purely on the basis of perhaps an interesting statistic, a survey like you mentioned, or what they feel is a little bit of a worthy topic to cover. Do you find that there is much thought given to this idea of press releases as a active part of an overall marketing strategy and how it fits in?
I find that surprisingly, we are our busiest and we've had our most growth during recessions. And so I don't wish that on anyone, but I think that a lot of marketers are aware that press releases are something that they should do, but it gets put on the back burner and everything else gets priority. And I think what happens during a downturn or a recession is they've paused their paid ad campaigns. So they can't spend that. And they're like, what could we do that won't cost very much? And they're like, oh, we keep putting out press releases, so let's try that. And some of my best customers have come from recessions, tried it and seen how it works and can work effectively. I think that it is one of the things that gets neglected and overlooked in marketing. I also think it's really frustrating for marketers because it's really hard to measure ROI of a press release. You don't get to include trackable URLs. You don't guarantee that you're going to always get media pickup. But generally, if you do a PR campaign of say 6 to 8 press releases and you're doing strategic types of press releases, probably 3 of them will result in earned media for you. And those are original articles about you. Often they'll link to you as well. Some places don't link. The New York Times generally never links to people. The Wall Street Journal generally never links to people. But I've had both of them link to customers who built out a resource page and were promoting a survey. And there was so much important data and infographics on that page that both of them broke their own rule and did link to the survey. And so it is possible. You just really have to build out a lot of great resources and education and not make it look like it's a landing page to sell something. And that is a little difficult because a marketer is at the end of the day wanting to sell something. And so it's difficult for them to trust something where they don't control the message. Because when a journalist writes the article, you don't control how it's sold, what the upsell is, call to action, things like that. But that being said, many of my clients have come back to me and said, we got like 800 links from news articles to our website and 600 of them bought. Does that make sense? 3/4 buy? And I said, it does, because you got to think about it. They read an article about you. It was an implied endorsement where a journalist wrote about you and chose you. And so the credibility that you have is through the roof. It's not, their blinders for advertising is not up. They're looking at you. And the people that decided to click through have already decided, I want to know a little bit more about this company and work with them. I've seen conversion rates from 25% to as high as, like I mentioned, 75% from the traffic that comes from these. Not everybody that reads the article is going to click through, but the people who do, generally have an invested interest. They've created some goodwill reading about you. They want to do business with you. And these are great customers. These are the customers who often do not price shop. They're not going to open a new tab and say, can I get this cheaper on Amazon? They want to do business with that company they just read about. And so that's one of the great things about the conversion rates that happen from these. I've actually had people say they've sent paid traffic to the articles, even though there's no tracking on there. So they can't retarget the people on that page. But they said the page converts so well that even if we take search engine traffic, it converts way better than our landing pages. And I think it's because of that. There is something that happens when a journalist writes about you that gives third-party corroboration. There's social proof, that credibility.
That's really interesting. And I suppose there are folks listening to this going, that makes sense for B2C brand or a D2C brand. What about those of us in the B2B space, and especially dealing with products that have a higher price point where there are multiple decision makers, etc.? If for them, would the strategy just be part of the overall brand awareness, or could there be more to it?
There could be more to it. I think that from a B2B standpoint, it really depends on what you're selling and how important it is to get the visibility out there in your industry. If getting articles written about you in trade magazines or publications where your customers are, then it's good because it's going to create that recognition front of mind, and also ideally maybe get some of them to convert. I had one person who was a waste management engineer, and he came back to me after he did a press release because he had won an award, and somebody, I think it was Australia, had reached out to him and said, we would be interested in building a facility and working with you. And he says, I don't know if this is going to come to fruition, but this would be a lot of money. He was talking like over $1 million for him. And because he said often these facilities are $30 to $40 million, and the engineering is probably the most important aspect of it. And so he was really happily surprised because he just was sending it out because people have said, hey, you won this award, you should get out there. And it is funny that sometimes people don't know about you. And if they see you in familiar trade publications or other places like that, you can become part of the buying opportunity. You may not be their first choice, but maybe you were never even in the selection of who they normally do business with. And all of a sudden you could potentially be there. Another thing that works really well is sharing your successes with your customers and your leads. There are probably always a certain number of people that are on the fence about whether they're going to use you or not. And if they get that implied endorsement and that social proof, that could be enough to push them over onto the side of actually using you. And the same thing with customers. If a customer sees you getting a lot of good publicity and sharing stuff that shows that you're an expert in the industry and that you're doing really well, how more likely are they to less do price shopping or think about replacing you? They're like, hey, they're working for us and we like what they're doing. And I see them in the news. These people are recognized. Why would we even look to go with someone else? We're just inviting trouble or problems that we currently don't have.
And with this idea of putting together a press release, you've alluded to the fact that putting it out there is certainly part of the equation, but having something that tells a good story, engages the potential readers is important. Obviously, journalists are doing a lot of the legwork. How can we increase the odds of a journalist taking this on once we have got the strategy part down? Are there elements within what we send to journalists that we should be aware of, honing on?
So journalists love numbers. Going back to the survey and study, you don't have to author numbers. There are numbers and data that exist within your industry. Bring them together in a compelling way and help that make the argument in your press release of what you're announcing. And so what you're announcing isn't the data, but you're pointing at the data for why you're saying a certain thing or feeling a certain way. And so that can really ground you and make it very easy for a journalist to say that's more hard news, because data and numbers is more hard news, where experiences and stories are more soft news. That being said, when we go back to story, soft news works. Journalists love a compelling story. So what is it that you're doing that's interesting? Sometimes it's just owning your story, sharing it. It could be how you started the company or what was the impetus for a recent change or a new product or something like that. You want to be authentic. You could potentially be inspirational. Feel free to share obstacles and vulnerability. Journalists do like that story and the hero arc, and all of those things work really well. And I had a customer share an embarrassing story with me. And I said, I think we should put a press release together where you share that. And they were like, why? And I was like, it really makes you relatable. And it is something that a lot of entrepreneurs identify with. And it became the lead opening in the article in Inc. magazine where they wrote about them a couple of pages. And they just were floored. Why would Inc. magazine have ever been interested in us? And I said, you have a really compelling story. You've grown, you're quite successful. And yet you had this mishap where you missed a holiday and the family had to get together in the garage and get product ready to ship out. And it's something that a lot of journalists and entrepreneurs can relate to. There are always setbacks and crazy experiences, and sometimes where you get caught off guard, even with some success. And that's just part of the entrepreneurial journey. And sharing that makes you really identifiable. Other things that can work really well is sometimes being the friendly jerk or the contrarian in your industry can work well, because a lot of times when there's a hot button issue in the industry, most of the people are all on one side. And if you're the one person who raises your hand and says, hey, here's some compelling reasons why you shouldn't jump so fast or consider that, or here's some cons to that argument. The electric car, everybody loves the electric car, it seems. But if you just raised your hand and said, hey, not so fast, we have environmental issues getting these minerals out of the ground to make the batteries, and we haven't solved what we're going to do with these batteries at the end of their life. And there's also some issues with car accidents and fires. And these kind of things need to be solved before we mandate electric cars across the board. And no one's going to say that person's irresponsible by saying that, but it is very level-headed and rational. And I've had some clients who are just wild and crazy, and they're okay with that. But you do run the risk that if you're wild and crazy, that you could set off some of your existing customers or make them uneasy. So any positions that you do take, you want to make sure that you're comfortable taking those in front of your existing customers as well. But it is really a great way to stand out because journalists like to be fair and balanced. And often they go to press with one side because nobody's raised their hand and said, I represent the other side. So if it's a hot button issue that gets a lot of media attention and you're the only person raising your hand and saying, not so fast, you stand the chance of being plugged into every one of those articles as the person who's really saying, not so fast. Here's the negative cloud over this hot button or this issue.
So when we're thinking about press releases, should we really be focusing in on making this timely and answering questions that perhaps people have at that time, as opposed to thinking of putting out or encouraging evergreen content?
Evergreen content can occasionally work, especially if it's seasonal. I had one client who always did, it was bedandbreakfast.com, which has now been absorbed, but they would put out around Halloween the 10 spookiest bed and breakfasts to stay in New England. And then they would do one for the South. And they would do stuff before Valentine's Day, the most romantic bed and breakfasts in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, all these states and things like that. And they did very well with that because the good thing about content like that, the evergreen content, is it was put together in a way that was very easy for journalists to just copy and paste. And busy journalists who are just looking to fill one of their quotas that week, it's easy for them to copy and paste a list of the top 10 bed and breakfasts in a particular area, their local area. And as long as it's safe content and not controversial, it's very easy for them to just take it as is and use it. You generally don't see the large newspapers using it, but USA Today did use it verbatim several times. You won't see the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal doing that, but you could potentially see dozens of daily newspapers and other publications pick it up as well as online. That's one of the things that where Evergreen can work really well. Also, at the beginning of the year or towards the end of the year, having something predictions for the next year in your industry is another type of evergreen thing that you can do annually. I have some clients that just do that every year. Early December, they send out stuff like that, and it does really well in their industry. It works really well for them. I think that the breaking news is what works really well. The data, the surveys, the things like that in general. And I think that they are the ones where people can be a little more creative and putting stuff out there that's really interesting. Research your industry for blind spots. And people always go, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, what are the things that when you go to a conference, the first thing you ask a colleague? Hey, have you noticed in the industry that everybody's now taking 90 to 120 days to pay instead of 30 to 60? That's interesting. But there could potentially be a story there. Tapping in a journalist and having some quotes ready on a particular issue is a great way to guarantee that you could potentially get an article written. Quotes are probably the most overlooked thing in a press release, and they're probably the most important thing. Other than the headline, quote is the most important element of the press release, because I have seen where journalists have written an article that was inspired by someone, included the quote that was in the article, had the managing editor say, this is a very weak quote, scratch it out, and then the company loses all mention of itself in the article, yet they inspired the article. If it's a really great quote, the journalist isn't going to care that it's a small company they've never heard about, and the managing editor is not going to care either. They're going to want to include it. So really have a powerful quote. You want to say it in a way that's very succinct, or have a little bit of, you can elevate the language and be creative with a quote. And so you want to say something that can't easily be paraphrased. If they were to paraphrase that into just regular language, something would be lost. Something, the beauty of it, or the art of it, or the conciseness of it, or sometimes the controversial side of it, where you take a controversial stance. They want to make sure that's mentioned, but you really do want to spend some time with the quote, because it is, so many quotes look like they're just written by committee. They're safe. And as a result, they don't add very much to the press release.
So I'm also curious about SEO. Is that something that we should take into consideration as we develop press releases?
I think a little bit. Now, press releases and SEO have a very weird history where, like 15 to 20 years ago, people would do a press release. It would get replicated. We call it syndicated onto a few different websites, usually subdomains on a website. Like all the releases that go on the wire appear on Yahoo Finance. And used to, that would give you a little bit of SEO juice. And it was very short-lived. But now they're all indicated that they're press releases. Google doesn't penalize them because they're duplicate content, because they recognize press releases get replicated, but they don't give you any real strong value for it. What you really are looking for is an original article about you, ideally one with links, but even when there are no links, you still get SEO benefit from it. Google has a patent on contextually telling in an article who the article is about and conveying link credit even when there is no URL. Google conveys that. I've had clients who say, I've just moved up in the search engine ranks, and could that article in the Washington Post have contributed to it? And I'm like, absolutely. But they said, but there's no link to me. And I said, here's a story that explains the patents that Google has and the fact that Google is conveying link credit in cases where they can tell the article contextually, they can tell that that's about you. And so they're giving you credit as if there is a link.
And I'd like to go back to this idea of garnering research and pose these interesting questions to people in your industry. Well, I don't know about you or certain other industries, but I think for at least some of us, we're at a stage in our lives where it's almost continually bombarded by surveys and requests for NPS scores and things of that nature. Is there a particular approach given that you would recommend in order to ensure that we are able to make a bit more of gain a bit more traction with potential respondents?
I think that partnering with a trade association is a great way, because I generally don't fill out surveys, especially if they're newsletters that I've signed up for and they're wanting me to do a survey and things like that. But when my association that I belong to sends me one, I'm I don't know why, but it's like a membership. I feel like I'm part of a community. I'm more apt to do it. And I think that's why I find trade associations a good place to get your survey in front of and have them send it out to their members. Sometimes they'll just send it out on social media, and that's enough to get several hundred responses. So their members are engaged and checking their social media. And when they see their own trade association making a request, they're more apt to do it. Other things I think that people can do is put together a package of the results of the survey. And if it's an industry wide survey or a definitive type survey, put together a report and let them know that you'll share that report with them if they complete the survey. And that's also a great opportunity for them to include their email address. Many of the surveys that my clients do, we don't collect any personal identifiers. And it is an opportunity that if you can make a compelling reason for them to submit their personal information, you can use that again for marketing and educating them, but also sharing the results of the survey and the press release with them. So it's a really, great ask. Again, if I was doing it on a survey, I would put it at the very end. I usually recommend SurveyMonkey, 4 questions per page, 16 questions. And then you could have on the next page saying, completely optional, give us your email address and we'll share this report and the findings of this survey and things like that with us. And if they complete that, then you'll have some additional information and additional opportunity to have a relationship with them ongoing.
And with constructing the press releases, looking at putting in a lot of the data and things of that nature is certainly important. Should we be looking at putting a call to action at the end of our press releases, or is that something that we need to bring to the fore?
It really varies. The problem is that the journalist who turns it into an article is probably not going to include a call to action at all. And the exceptions I've had is where people build landing pages where they're collecting for a white paper and other types of resources. And often a journalist will include that in the article, usually towards the end. For more information, visit this URL and things like that. But they generally, if it's to buy a product, they usually never include the URL in most stories and things like that. You can have a call to action in the press release, but the press release is usually not what the customer or the end user sees. They generally usually see the article about you. That being said, even when there is no URL linking directly to you, you'll get a lot of people searching for your company name and brand and then going to your website because they've read that article. It's also a great way if you don't rank very highly for your name. Let's say you have a very generic name and you're doing a campaign and you've got some articles out there. It would be a good opportunity for you to do paid advertising for search under your brand.
Mhm. So we've talked about including stories, case studies, and research. Are there perhaps companies that you've seen use press releases quite effectively? And I know you touched upon bed and breakfast as well with their particular strategy, but are there perhaps a couple of other strategies that you've noticed that have worked particularly well for companies?
Right. I had seen, there's so many. I've seen, for example, I mentioned the industry blind spots. I
Mhm.
had a local carpet company from New Jersey reach out to me. They weren't regional, they weren't national. It was like one location in New Jersey. It was an important location, but that was it. And I told them I didn't think PR was going to work for them. And they said, we have a budget, so help us spend it. So we did several releases. We did 5 or 6 releases and nothing happened. And I just felt bad taking their money, but they're like, we have a year budget, let's use it. So I was having a brainstorm session with them. And one of the things I asked is, who's your enemy? And I thought it was going to be the guy across the street who has a carpet company. And they were like, no. They said, it is the big box home improvement stores. They are terrible for our industry. They don't require the people who install carpet to have ever installed carpet before. The only requirement they put on people when they call a phone number is, do you have a home improvement license? And that could be just putting up walls or doing decks or patios and things like that, not people who've necessarily done carpet. And they say that often the padding that they use is really inferior to a good padding that you can get with a local carpet company. And also the selection isn't as strong and other factors. The biggest of which is they say we often go into houses that ordered from the big box home improvement stores and have to re-stretch it and just reinstall it correctly from the beginning. And so we did a press release about that, talked about this, how local carpet companies are finding it difficult to compete against these companies that don't seem to care about the service and product they're actually giving their customers. And it did phenomenally well. The floor and trade publications, over a dozen of them picked it up. And it did well because all of the subscribers to those trade publications are not the big box home improvement stores. It's other local carpet companies. They're all in the same boat. So they all loved it and it did really well. A couple of the publications said that it got more letters to the editor than anything they published in like years. And it was just one of these blind spots where he knew this, but no one had really in their trade publications talked about it. And so they brought it forward. We did a series of press releases on this issue going forward, and each one of them got pickup. None of them did as well as that first one with a dozen articles, but they did get probably a total of 30 or 40 articles dealing with that, and how they even talked about how they market against the big box home improvement stores and compete against them. And that customer, I pointed out, none of the people reading these articles are your customers. How does this help you? And they came back to me and showed me a book they put together, a binder, and they had all these articles in it where they had been picked up in these trade publications, and their local newspaper and New Jersey Magazine had also picked it up and written about them. And they said, when we go give people a quote in their house, we show them this, and we now close, I think it was around 14% more of these quotes than we used to, just by having this brag book. They called it their brag book. And it worked really well for them. And they said that what they think happens is people are looking at getting carpet done and they're considering 2 or 3 people. And they're just like, let's go with the guy that is recognized nationally. He's been in Floor Trade Weekly. He's been in this publication. If he's within 10% of the price of someone else they're looking for, they're willing to pay it and to get someone that they feel is the right person for the job. And I think that's a really great way where you can leverage credibility and really make it work as part of your sales process.
Mickie, are there perhaps a couple of aspects to this whole idea of creating press releases that you find doesn't get talked about very much, doesn't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
I think one of the biggest things that I see is the lost opportunities of people doing press releases and not taking into account multimedia. Images are really important. I say you can include up to 2 photos or images. Your logo is not really important. If they want the logo, they can pull it from the website. I like to include candid photos, not stock photos. So many small businesses want to have professional stock photos of their product or service. And I'm telling you, the ones that work best and that the media loves the most are the ones that show an actual customer using your product, or someone sitting in front of your product using it, rather than having it on blue velvet with the perfect lighting and things like that. And when a journalist is looking at 2 stories and they're equal, they're not necessarily breaking news, but they're equal, but one has a really compelling photo and this company posts their content online, they know that photo is going to give an edge over the other one. So they're going to use that one. And so that's a really lost opportunity for you if you're not using photos. Videos, I'm not seeing them use them yet, but I think that over the next 5 years, that will be used. And so that's another opportunity. Again, it doesn't have to be professional, but it could just be B-roll of people using your product or different experiences like that. But I think that for that right now, it might be a little too early, but definitely the photos are really a great thing to use. Other opportunities are if you have really interesting data and numbers, putting together an infographic in addition to the press release about it is another great way to really get out there. I've seen one client said that their infographic got picked up and it was now on 1,000 websites for a really hot button tech security thing that was out there. And it really showed the price of what a data breach could be to a small business. And it worked really well. And it was one of these images that just captured everything, and it just went viral and did extremely well. So I think don't forget you're working with content and words, but their photos can also be important. Infographics and other types of charts and things like that could also be important.
And if there's someone thinking about video, the idea of focusing on images and graphics and things of that nature is because it's static, and most publications would prefer to use that as opposed to, say, a media piece, which can only really be used on online publications. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also have been told by a few journalists that right now, legal is like not quite sure about you taking video footage from a client and putting it on your website and then you retaining ownership of it. And how does that work? And it shouldn't be a problem because technically, when you do a press release, it's like you're opening it up for the journalist to take what they want and
Mhm.
to craft it in a way that they want. And there's just a licensing legal aspect to video that a lot of people just aren't comfortable using yet. And I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons that a lot of places aren't using it. I know that some people have just taken TikTok videos and put them on their website and got in trouble. Like I think The Guardian in the UK and other places. And it is a slippery slope of that. But I think when you are putting it out as part of a press release package, the assumption is you're hoping journalists will use it. You're hoping that the video will get out there, and we'll see what happens. But I think that's a natural progression, and we definitely will be moving towards video.
And to wrap things up, Mickie, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway that I would want people to have is that this is something that can work for small businesses. It generally works better for small businesses and entrepreneurs than it does for larger companies. So many people think that press releases are just for the big guys. And the big guys, Microsoft and Google, they pump out a lot of press releases. But journalists don't love writing articles about them. They do. But what they like to do is to be seen as curators, and they are gatekeepers for their audience. And they like to discover small little unknown companies and products and services that their audience may not know about and put a spotlight on it. And they get the credit for that. And I think that's why Kickstarters and Indiegogos and things like that do so well with the news. The journalists like to jump on them because if it's a really interesting thing, they're seen as curators.
Mm.
And I think that you being a small business is not an obstacle or a setback for press releases to work for you. I think it's actually just the opposite, that they can work really well because of your small size. And you don't have to pretend that you're a big company. You don't have, so there's such an imposter syndrome with small businesses where they're like, I don't want people to know that it's just me and my wife or something like that. And journalists don't care. They think that's quaint. That's a cute story. Own it and share it. Be vulnerable. People want to help small businesses succeed. And so don't be afraid of sharing your story and who you are.
Brilliant. And if listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Sure. So the website's ereleases.com. All our social media is there. You can chat with our editors or give us a call, speak to an editor. We have no salespeople, no commissions or quotas and things like that. I do recommend for anybody who's interested in building a PR campaign, I have a free masterclass on PR strategies, and these are the ones that work for my clients. The survey that I mentioned is one of those, and it's generally about an hour-long video, but it really gives you a good audit of newsworthy types of press releases you could be doing about your business. And it's available at ereleases.com/plan, PLAN. And again, it's completely free because I'm all about educating my customers and getting people to do more strategic types of releases. Because if they're doing more strategic types of releases, they're going to have more successes and they're going to want to do more types of press releases like that.
Terrific. We'll include links to that in the show notes. Mickie, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been great talking with you.